Are you recording?
And now I think we're ready to go. So,
David, that's a lovely picture of you walking in the cemetery.
yeah, thank you. You know, the joke we tell on campus these days is, in order for me to recognize you, you have to cover up the bottom 2/3 of your face. There's a certain anonymity that we get with all this mask wearing. You guys are past mandatory mask wearing indoors, is that right?
No, we wear masks in the halls and so forth. We wear masks here and gatherings, except for meals.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
We're quite strict.
Yeah. On campus at Sarah Lawrence, that's become optional. And I think the majority of people have dispensed with masks most of the time. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about today. And yes, that's not actually me. Some resemblance notwithstanding. Joe Biden has, I think, more gray hair than I do. But I do want to actually finish this series of lectures that we've been working our way through for weeks now. And when I say series, it started with the issues that we should be discussing as we approach a national election. Of course, the conclusion of that national election is, in one sense, long past, in another sense, right in sight, with the vote finally occurring in Georgia to determine the runoff for the last remaining Senate seat. But what I've been focusing on for the last few weeks is more general issues in international politics that face the world in the 2020s. And we did speak last week about one of those issues that got surprisingly little attention during the midterm elections, which of course is the war on terror and the end of the war on terror with the withdrawal of Afghanistan. And the picture is actually Joe Biden walking a military cemetery as he's just ordered the final withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan, reflecting on the costs of that war. And the idea that in important respects, the last 20 years of American foreign policy, to the extent that the organizing framework has been a war on terror, we moved into a framework that was incredibly costly in terms of lives. And I showed you the figure that it's approaching 1 million lives lost in the various campaigns brought under the umbrella of the war on terror, and that the majority, not the majority, but the largest single share of those casualties are civilians. And obviously, when the number of civilians that are being killed in a conflict is larger than the number of combatants, that suggests both limits to the justice and limits to the efficacy of the campaign. And I am certainly of the mind that justice is an independent standard by which we judge our military campaigns. But if you're more pragmatic and you're just thinking in terms of efficacy, a war that kills more civilians than combatants tends to generate tremendous enmity toward the perceived aggressor. And to be as clear as possible, the United States was the perceived aggressor, the occupier, and the origin of the rain of violence coming down from the sky in terms of drone warfare and bombing. And so all of that to say, it's not clear that we did ourselves much favor, even in our stated objectives. Afghanistan is now again under the control of the Taliban. Iraq is very close to being a failed state. We are perhaps a little bit safer in terms of the threat of terror, but it's not clear that we wouldn't have been safer if we just would have put in place the domestic policies that we put in place. And having said all that, we've probably damaged our reputation, produced a great deal of hostility towards us in the region. And finally, I want to focus on the opportunity cost, right? I showed you last week, we spent $8 trillion, right? You know, as much as we spend overall on all of our federal budget over the course of 16 years on this campaign. And we don't have a lot to show for it, but another way of thinking about this is, what might we have gained had we spent that 16 times our annual budget, that $8 trillion, on domestic initiatives? Might we be a more equal society, a more secure society, and might our politics be less mean and divisive as a result? Might we be building the international institutions that we require in ways that I'll focus on today to cope with the growing vulnerability of the world to the 8+ billion human beings on it? And might we also be building institutions that are more effective at promoting gradual democratization in places in the world that are currently ruled by autocracy or failed states? And so it seems to me, right, that's to set the stage for where we're going. This is where we've been, right? We've talked a lot about the rise of autocracy, the Russian assault on Ukraine, and simultaneously on the post-war international order, the rise of Xi in China, and the way in which Premier Xi's rule represents a consolidation of personalistic autocracy, and a likely emergence of a more tense relationship between China and the United States in the coming decade, and the sense that there's a overall emerging global competition between democracy and autocracy. Autocracy, obviously, not a perfectly successful alternative to democracy. And even as we're giving, right, these lectures over these last few weeks, we see protests breaking out in Iran and in China, perhaps also in Russia, although people in Russia are voting more with their feet, hundreds of thousands of young men fleeing the country rather than being drafted. The tremendous courage of the Iranian protesters facing just the harshest possible brutality in the suppression of their protests. And by the way, very brave protesters in China as well. All of that to say, we can look at the failure of the zero COVID policy in China. We can look at the failure of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Autocracy is not batting 1,000, for sure. But having said that, neither is democracy. And so there does appear to be something of a stalemate between these two systems. And I would suggest that both of them, when they're functioning imperfectly, damaged democracy, wounded autocracy, may be more dangerous to each other as a result of the standard move in politics of trying to solve domestic failure by turning attention to international rivalry. And so that's the dangerous, intense moment that we're in. I now want to focus in conclusion of this lecture series on why, despite that rivalry between autocracy and democracy, those tensions, the dynamics that are likely to make our relations still more tense and to drive us closer and closer to some kind of new Cold War, that it is absolutely essential that we resist the tendency that we fell into in especially the war on terror, to divide the world into blocks and to treat one block as our friends and the other block as our enemies. If we demonize autocracy, we will not be able to cooperate. And we absolutely need to cooperate with China. We need to cooperate with a variety of other societies that we may feel, I think appropriately, are domestically unjust and internationally our rivals. But we're going to have to learn to work with our rivals, or else the planet is frankly doomed. And so let me pivot today into the threats, and these are issues that we've talked about before, so I'm going to be brief but update us a little bit. This is the third big theme, that the context for international relations in the 21st century is basically indissociable interdependence. We are completely connected, whether that's economically. We talk about a Cold War with China, but China is still the largest purchaser of US government issued debt. We are still the largest market for Chinese exports, right? And so it's very peculiar to be in Cold War between societies that are that interdependent on each other, but we're also interdependent in terms of technology and our capacity to influence each other. We spoke last week a little bit about the weaponization of social media, and in particular, the fact that democracies probably cannot close themselves down to being influenced by autocracy via social media. And so we're going to have to get more sophisticated in protecting our domestic public spheres from that kind of targeted interference. But today, I really want to focus on the global as opposed to the international, on the trends that affect the planet as a whole and that are in no way limited by national boundaries, by political territorial boundaries. The most obvious example of this, and where I'll start for a moment, is climate change. But I want to pivot from that to the idea that climate change represents just one of several forms of global catastrophic risk, and that we cannot assume that these risks are going to manifest one at a time, as opposed to being simultaneously catastrophic, and therefore that we are going to face the language that's being made popular by Adam Tooze, polycrises, right? Not just one crisis, but multiple crises that are global in scope and that intersect, that occur at the same time. So starting with climate change, how's that for a cheery note to get started on today? Sorry, starting with climate change, and this will be familiar, right? We see in the 21st century an absolutely clear trend. The average temperature on the globe today is about 1.1 degrees Celsius hotter than it was in the pre-industrial era. If we go back to the 1840s to set our benchmark, we're 1.1 degrees hotter today. This diagram uses 1880 as a benchmark. And as you can see, another way to put this is that the 5 hottest years in history, and we can go back hundreds of thousands of years now by drilling into ice cores to see the history, that the temperature of the planet. The 5 hottest years in history have occurred in the last 10 years. In the US in 2021, we were subject to what one climatologist called a statistically impossible year in terms of the number of records broken. And this is not just happening in the United States, it's happening globally. So, right, this diagram shows us the comparison of temperatures from the beginning of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, and how much of the planet is not just 1 degrees hotter, but maybe 2 degrees hotter or 4 degrees hotter than it was a century ago. And please note the concentration of those hot pockets in the Arctic region, which is devastating the polar ice caps at the North Pole, right? Note what happened to the Indian subcontinent. Summer that was so hot that it melted asphalt, followed by monsoon rains that were so devastating in Pakistan that it resulted in millions of people being displaced, rendered homeless, and basically a nationwide crop failure, right? And so the kind of extreme weather that a hotter planet generates is being felt by us at 1.1 degrees. But it is clear that we have already emitted into the atmosphere enough carbon dioxide and other heat trapping gases that the planet will heat to 1.5 degrees, right? So we're not even caught up to the level of heating that our already emitted gases will generate. And we're continuing to emit greenhouse trapping gases at a rate that is totally out of line with what we have pledged and what we need to do, so that it appears that really there's very little chance that we're going to limit global climate change to less than 2 degrees unless we figure out how to pull some of the heat trapping gases, especially the carbon dioxide, back out of the atmosphere. And so, right, that's as I say, an illustration of the kind of problem we face. If we get to 2 degrees Celsius global climate heating, the UN and the US military both predict that there will be, by the middle of this century, in the next 50 years, upwards of 1 billion climate refugees. And I just think, if you think about that for a moment, right? We have 14 million displaced people in the Ukraine right now. Approaching 10 million of them are international refugees. It is straining the resources of all the countries surrounding it. That would be a drop in the bucket if you think about 1 billion refugees. It will overwhelm the coping capacity of the governments of the societies that those refugees move to. And on the other hand, to refuse to accept those refugees will be almost certainly to condemn 1 billion humans to death. And so this is civilization threatening the way in which we are transforming the climate of the planet. And we need to be able to act to avert the worst of this. That requires sustained global cooperation. I'll get into the details of this, but the United States is moving in a better direction today than it was 2 years ago. Much better in terms of our pledges and the apparent direction of our public policy. And the United States could finally get its act together and become a leader in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And even if we do that to the degree required to get to net zero by 2030, the stated goal, and we're not there yet, to be clear, but if we got there, and China and India and Brazil and Malaysia and Pakistan and Bangladesh, and I could keep going, right? Don't follow suit, our efforts are worth nothing, right? And so this requires global cooperation to work. And that means that we have to manage an environment in which we have much more international rivalry likely ahead of us than we have had for the last 20, 30 years. We've got to enter that environment and somehow still figure out how to cooperate in coping with the most urgent issues we face. When we spoke about this together last summer, I suggested what I think is the most valuable framework for thinking through not just climate change, but also the other forms of planetary environmental risk that we face. And that's the framework that was developed by John Rockstrom from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and Will Stefan from the National University Climate Change Institute in Australia. And this is called the Breaking Boundaries, or the Planetary Boundaries Framework. There is now a Netflix special based on Rockstrom's book that tries to make this framework more accessible. There's also technical scientific publications. And what this framework does, and I think it's the reason I think it's so valuable, is it suggests both the most specific vulnerabilities of the planet and differentiates them, right? So climate change, it turns out, is but one of 9 places where human activity is potentially disrupting planetary processes that could then fundamentally disrupt the overall biosphere or gaiosphere of planet Earth. It also, this framework, gives us metrics for measuring the extent of the damage. And so let me just refresh your memory, provide a little brief refresher on this material. And I would point out, right, if you look at the 9 frameworks, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but if you look at climate change, which we tend to focus our energies on and sound the alarm bells most loudly about, and the way this framework of analysis operates, it gives us zones of safe operating space in terms of the way we affect the Earth's biosphere boundaries, and then unsafe, and then dangerous, right? And so in climate change, we're actually in the unsafe but not yet dangerous realm. And that doesn't mean we're not headed very quickly to the dangerous realm, but we're not there yet. In terms of biosphere integrity, and really this has to do with the diversity of biological life on the planet, or to put it in the negative, the extinction rate. And the focus here is especially on extinctions that potentially disrupt entire ecosystems. So for instance, pollinators, right? And you've probably seen the recent precipitous decline in the monarch butterfly population, important pollinators. Similarly, bees being threatened on a planetary scale. Fragility in biosystems, much further along. We are in the midst of a great extinction right now, and we may have wiped something like 50% of animal life off the planet in the last 100 years. Novel entities, and here we're talking in particular about plastics, right, becoming ubiquitous, entering the gene pools at the microplastic levels of almost all entities on the planet, all biological life on the planet. And so again, right, further advanced, perhaps more dangerous than climate change. Biogeochemical flows, sorry, but the phosphorus and nitrogen cycles of the planet have been substantially disrupted by industrial agriculture, by the use of fertilizer and pesticide and insecticide. And what they do is they get into our water streams, etc. And so all of that to say, right, these are efforts not just to sketch, but to systematically quantify and then measure the threats facing the planet. And these environmental threats are extreme. And again, there are limits on the capacity of any one nation operating in isolation to do anything meaningful about this. This is going to require sustained international cooperation. So with that general framework in mind, and I'll come back to some more details in a few minutes, I want to transition now to COP27. COP, right, is the conference of the participants in the United Nations framework on climate change. It met in Egypt last month, and at the last possible minute, actually in overtime, hammered out an agreement. And the agreement was never going to be an agreement on further reduction of greenhouse gases, not from COP27. Let's hope COP28 returns to that issue. Part of the issue here, and this points to the stickiness of these issues, is that China and the US had broken off talks in the month leading up to COP27 because Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, right? And China punished the US for allowing her to go by withdrawing from those talks. Fortunately, we began our meetings again between probably the two most important countries in the world when it comes to climate change at COP27, and it does appear that talks between China and the US on reducing greenhouse gas emissions have resumed, and thank goodness for that. But because of that, and because of the urgency of this second issue, the focus of COP27 was really what's called damage and loss or mitigation. And this is assisting poorer countries in coping with the way in which climate change is impacting them, helping them on the one hand to recover from the extreme weather catastrophes that are befalling them with much greater regularity, and then hopefully helping them also to build up greater infrastructure and resilience so that future droughts like what hit China and Europe this summer, future floods like what hit Pakistan this fall, future fires like the fires that are occurring all over the world now, the monsoon floods in South Africa. We could keep going, but so that we get better at containing the damage that extreme weather does. And the thing to notice, I think, in terms of a general framework here, this graph I know is a little hard to read, but going up the graph is a scale of vulnerability to climate change caused disaster, right? So that the further up the scale you are, the more vulnerable you are, with Somalia at the very top, and then we have Pakistan and India in the higher ranges, China a little further down. And I think the thing to notice here, the size of the bubble of the country indicates the overall amount of carbon emissions that that country has contributed to the stratosphere. And so I hope you can see, generally speaking, there's an inverse relationship in which the most vulnerable countries have contributed the least to global climate change. The least vulnerable countries have contributed the most. And the framework of a loss and damage negotiated treaty is supposed to address this by forcing the most responsible countries to assist the least responsible countries in coping with the loss and damage that climate change causes. And to be as clear as possible about this, the reason that the most responsible countries are least vulnerable is in part to do with their geographic situation. And it's not time to go into it, but there's some reason to believe that actually this is not just geographic good fortune, but that those regions were the regions that were most likely to industrialize in terms of both their geographic location and the way that location affects their histories. But having said all of that, the fact that the United States and these European societies, Japan and Russia, did successfully industrialize allows them also to better protect themselves. They have the wealth, the resources, the governmental capacity, the infrastructure to better protect themselves from climate change. So it's both about geographic situation and about social resources and governmental capacity. Again, just to reiterate why this is such an essential issue of global and climate justice. I think this is the fundamental issue of climate justice. Note first, right, that the United States is the richest country in the world, has a third of the world's wealth, despite having only a little bit more than 4% of the world's population, and that the Europeans are also obviously highly disproportionately wealthy. And of course, those richest countries have contributed the most to the gases that are trapping heat. Those wealthy countries had pledged going back to 2016 to contribute $100 billion per year by 2020. And you can see, right, that what they've actually delivered in every year since that pledge was made is short of that $100 billion pledge. In 2020, it was about 20 billion or 20% short. And to be as clear as possible, people who look at this say 100 billion, that's a tiny fraction of the amount that justice and effective policy actually require. And yet we hadn't been able to muster even the 100 billion, right? And so this is what COP27 focused on. I wish I could tell you that the outcome was a successful treaty. That was not the case, but the outcome was at least an agreement that the rich countries, including the United States, China, and the European Union, none of which had agreed to be bound to contributing to a loss and damage framework in the past, all of them agreed, and agreed in particular to start a working group to determine how much would actually be delivered and when. And so we'll just have to monitor and see. But I do think that actually COP27 potentially delivered some valuable progress on a really important and up until this point mainly neglected issue of climate justice. And so that's a little bit of good news, which given the overall tone of what we're going to be talking about today is really important to see. Now, let's go back to the bad news. And that is that what we're seeing at a global level is totally inadequate to solve the climate change problem. So this diagram is essential. This shows you what the pre-Paris baseline was for carbon dioxide emission. Steps shows you policies that have actually been implemented, right? And so this is a significant improvement in terms of the Paris baseline, right? NZE is net zero emissions. And so if we're going to get to net zero emissions by 2050, which is what came out of recent rounds of COP, we are way off from where we need to be. APS is pledges, right? And so steps is policy, APS is pledges. The pledges get us closer to net zero, but the problem is that if we look at the totality of policy actually passed in the world up until this point, it doesn't bring us very close to what the countries have actually pledged, and still further from net zero, which is the stated goal, which is probably what's required to keep, and you can see here, right, the planet to 1.5 degrees warming. If we instead manage actually to implement all of the pledges in an expeditious way, we get closer. And by the way, even net zero might take us up to 2 degrees. Here we get much closer to 2 to 2.5 degrees. If we look at just the current enacted policies, we're going up to 2.5 to 3 degrees global heating. And at that point, the likelihood of runaway self-reinforcing processes, the polar ice caps melting completely, and then the various tidal processes that cool the hemispheres being disrupted, that's the kind of catastrophic scenario. And so clearly we have to do better than the policy already enacted. Again, we need international cooperation. We need to be funding this, but we also need to be devising treaties that have enforcement mechanisms in order to get the reluctant governments of the world to commit to this framework, even when it is going to be costly if we're going to avert this global catastrophe. one more thing to be looking at in terms of the background of where we are. And I think this is really important to notice, right? This is how much fossil fuel is likely to be burned over the next 30 years. And as you can see, this actually tops out, and you can see the little dents caused by COVID, right? But then we go back to increasing. But by 2030, it is likely that we're going to see a reduction in fossil fuel consumption with the current policies in place. And the main thing that is driving this, frankly, is not policy, it's economics. And this, again, I think is very hopeful news. And so what this diagram shows you is the cost of solar panels, right, from 2009 to 2020 has come down by over 90%, making solar electricity now the most economical way of generating electricity in the world. The second most economical way now is onshore wind, right? And please note that for many of the forms of power generation that involve using fossil fuels, they've stayed constant or grown more expensive. They're much more volatile. They involve much more transportation. And so they're also more vulnerable to geopolitical shocks like the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. There are very good economic reasons, really for the first time in our recent history, to be relying on renewable, sustainable energy sources. And on the other hand, the image I've put here is the Saudi pavilion at COP27. The recognition on the part of the petrostates and the large fossil fuel companies that the economic deck is now tilted against them and that public policy is moving in the direction of sustainable renewable energy is leading groups like Saudi and Chevron and Shell to work as best they can to try to undermine all efforts at altering our energy infrastructure. And so I think the real battle coming up is the battle between the economics and the environmental science of transitioning to renewable energy and the incredibly rich, incredibly powerful vested interests that are going to continue to do everything they can to generate the wealth that their reserves represent, even at the cost of the future of the human species and biological life on the planet. Again, this is why we need strong international cooperation to address this coming struggle. So now looking just a little bit more easily, I think, read diagrams, right? And I'm sorry, this shows you the global emissions gap, right? In much simpler language, policies and action, right? Pledges and what would be required to get to 1.5 degrees. I like this diagram, which comes from the Climate Action Tracker. And the United States has made some progress of late. I'm about to talk about that, but so we concentrate maybe on China as a place that's actually increasing its use of coal right now, and where we've really got to do good work to try to get them to recognize that their interest is not in staying on this path, but getting on a much more sustainable path. Speaking of which, let's look at the United States. And if we combine, right, the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed just a few months ago, Joe Manchin finally came on board, the much more limited version of the original legislation, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we could throw the CHIPS Act in here as well, right? There are now hundreds of billions of dollars, approaching $1 trillion of incentives for transforming our energy infrastructure, our transportation infrastructure, our housing infrastructure, all our agriculture infrastructure as well, all in the direction of making it more sustainable. And so again, if we look only at the United States and we look at where we were headed, and then what these bills do, right, and how much closer they get us to our Paris Pledge, but also note that we're still going to miss our Paris Pledge by 2030 substantially, right? And this represents, right, this is just the spending from the Inflation Reduction Act, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, and almost exclusively in subsidies, right? And so what the diagram here shows you is carrots, not sticks, right? We moved away from the old framework, for instance, of carbon taxing, of trying to make companies pay for the cost that their emissions was inflicting on our economy and the globe. And instead, we have to be honest about it. What we're doing is giving some of the most profitable companies in the country hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies to do what is necessary to save the planet and the human species. And unfortunately, if this is the only way we can get it done, if this is the only way we can get it through the Senate, if this is the only way that Joe Manchin will sign on, I guess we have to give major corporate welfare. We've done it. And the result is, if you look at this diagram, right, as opposed to where we were, we're now going to be spending billions of dollars more to build out our green infrastructure to make it possible to actually transition to a sustainable energy system, to decarbonize important sectors of our economy. And in a sense, there's a big transition that's occurring, and I think we're going to have to be prepared for the next battles and in climate change to be occurring not in Congress and legislatively. We've got the legislation passed, but occurring in courts and administrative agencies as we try to implement these policies, and as there will be no doubt substantial resistance to implementing them, either trying to game the implementation of these policies or trying to stop it altogether through the courts. This is where the action shifts now. But to not lose the forest for the trees, this allowed Joe Biden and John Kerry to go to Egypt to the most recent COP negotiations in a leadership position, being able to say that the United States has finally taken meaningful climate change action. And thank goodness, both in terms of the justice and the sustainability of our domestic policy, and in terms of having a president and an envoy who were effectively negotiating on the global stage. This is what we need in the decades to come. And if we end up in a new Cold War, it's going to be much more difficult to do all of this. So now, coming back to the broader framework of why this is so urgent. And I'm going to be very quick here in going through a succession of categories that help us to understand. I've spoken with you before about Nick Bostrom, who heads the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, and his introduction of this idea of global catastrophic risk and a vulnerable world hypothesis. And his claim is that essentially humanity has never before been capable of causing global catastrophic risk. So our cultures, our institutions, our worldviews are not evolved, don't contain the resources to allow us to manage the risks we can now cause to the planet, risks that are not just personal or local, but instead global and transgenerational, that are not imperceptible or endurable, but in fact terminal. And as productive as this framework is, and as important as Bostrom's work is, the new thinking suggests, right, that global catastrophic risk is too timid a category to actually capture the extent of the risk that the planet faces, in that global catastrophic risk tends to think about one risk at a time. Whereas this new category, and I've pointed to Adam Tooze, though there are a number of scholars working on this, of polycrisis, with apologies for the jargon, suggests, look, we may not just have one global catastrophic risk, we may have three or more occurring simultaneously, and that they may threaten irreversible catastrophic degradation of humanity's prospects. And so a pandemic, gene pool pollution, and global climate change all occurring at the same time, or heaven forbid, nuclear or biological war overlapping with climate change and a new pandemic. Those are the kinds of scenarios that a polycrisis evolves. And I don't mean to be engaged in scare tactics in introducing this literature, but what I am suggesting is that we live in a world that poses tremendous risk, or to put it differently, where we, the collective human species that just reached 8 billion, that has all this amazing technology, right? And this is right what I want to share with you, where this is now superseded. We were at 7.7 billion in 2019. In 2022, we're at 8 billion. We have this tremendous technological revolution going on, our computational power, our capacity to intervene in the genome and to re-edit DNA. I'm sorry, to edit DNA. The fact that, right, we are so prevalent and so constantly pushing into new environments where we are constantly coming into contact with species that we've had limited contact with up until this point, that the animal species of the world are moving about 20 miles a year, because that's what climate change does. It makes the places they live hotter. So they move away from the equator, they move higher in elevation. And the result is that there's more and more human animal contact, and more prospects for, therefore, viruses spilling over from the non-human animal world into the human world, and more pandemics. What used to be maybe a once a century or once a millennium phenomenon, scientists are predicting may be happening every decade in the coming century, right? And so again, some of this stuff is us degrading the biosphere and other natural processes on the planet. Some of this stuff is just the sheer number of humans and our interaction with nature making us more vulnerable. So with all of that in mind, let me conclude by suggesting that we have to, it is imperative that we learn the lessons of the mistakes from the war on terror. And just to reiterate briefly, during the war on terror, the United States was attacked. A clear act of aggression or warfare, the September 11th, 2001 attacks. But we moved from the fact that we were attacked into war footing so quickly, so reflexively, that it makes one wonder, why were we so fast to move into the idea that this is a war and has to be fought using the military attacking other nations. I showed you a week ago how tremendously costly and unproductive this 20-year excursion was. So why didn't we entertain other possible forms of reaction. And I want to suggest that the tendency for bipolar thinking, for trying to organize the world into essentially two categories, our allies and our adversaries, is deeply entrenched in international relations theory, in our diplomatic core, in our military industrial complex, that since the United States has become a global superpower, right? Going back to the first third of the 20th century, we have increasingly lived in a bipolar world. And so that's shaped the basic lens through which we view world politics. And the fact that the idea that jihadi, global, Islamic fundamentalist terrorism represented the new axis of international relations allowed us to continue to employ that framework as we entered a world in which it really didn't work anymore. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Global communism was no longer our rival. Rather than imposing, forcing the world into a new bipolar framework, we should have been better at noticing that although jihadi terrorism is a threat to us, it's not of a kind with the Soviet Union. It's a very different animal. So that's one aspect of what I think we need to learn and learn to resist, that we cannot live any longer in a world that we think of as bipolar. It just won't work. The other category that I think we imposed immediately on the world again is the friend enemy distinction. Right. And Carl Schmitt, there's a whole political theory of seeing politics through the lens of friend enemy. And we, in a sense, demanded that the world divide along that axis as well. And in particular, treating all Islamic fundamentalism is automatically an enemy, and that the only form that friends could take would be democratically organized polities, led us again to distort the world, to diminish the possibilities for cooperation, to think in new ways. And so, as we leave the war on terror behind, we have to recognize that we need a more nimble, a more nuanced, a more accurate frame or lens for viewing the world than the ones we've been using up until this point. So a few more specific ideas here. So we have to reject the dominant framework of bipolar thinking and friend enemy and return to a multilateral issue by issue framework. There are many countries out there. Some of them are our allies, some of them are our rivals, some of them demand greater latitude in their regions. We have to relate to them one by one rather than sorting them into two big blocks. And we have to relate to them issue by issue. We do not want China invading Taiwan, right? And we have to do everything we can to prevent that. But we also absolutely need China to stop burning coal. And to get them to do that, we're going to have to work with them on that issue, even as we work against them on Taiwan. We should be able to do that, at least to have the bandwidth to make our policy and our relations differential in that way. We also need to work closely with and strengthen our relationships with our natural allies. And so the worry here is the kind of America first foreign policy that we had under the previous administration that in many ways frayed our relationships with our existing allies. And I think the Biden administration has been reasonably good about rebuilding those relations. Obviously, Emmanuel Macron is in Washington right now, and Biden is doing his best to repair relations with France, which have been strained not only by Donald Trump, but also by some of the Biden administration decisions. But to recognize that the countries that are our natural allies, we need to be able to work closely and carefully in concert with. And At the same time, we need to maintain working relations with our natural adversaries. And that means we need to resist the temptation to demonize them. We need to condemn, the Iranians when they turn the Islamic Guard against unarmed young protesters who are asking for nothing other than the right to be with whom they want to be, lead their lives the way they want to be, a modicum of personal freedom, not even necessarily political freedom. We have to condemn that, but we also have to be able to work with many countries who we do not uniformly admire or respect. We cannot afford to simply put them in the enemy category and treat them as powers that need to be contained or overthrown. That moment in our foreign policy has passed. We need to build defenses against interference with our domestic democratic politics, to recognize that the autocratic adversaries will try to sow the seeds of dissension using social media to influence our politics, and that this is a very important new emerging front of foreign relations. And so we're going to have to become much more strategic, much more diligent in protecting our public sphere, but also much more intelligent in recognizing the limits of our capacity to defend ourselves from this kind of interference. And so to be able to discern the interference and put it in a place where it cannot sow the seeds of havoc within our domestic politics. We need to recognize that our interests do converge with societies that in other respects are our rivals. And so that there is an opportunity for strategic cooperation on essential issues, climate change, but those other 8 planetary boundaries all represent really important areas where we need to be cooperating, even with those countries with whom we are rivals. And yes, I think we've got to add Russia to the list here. And finally, we need to recognize, and this is related to defending our domestic democratic politics, that when domestic politics is so fractious, and when international relations is pulled into domestic politics, it makes doing any of the above incredibly difficult. And so some effort to return to a form of consensus on foreign policy domestically, some sense that, right, our partisan politics stops at our borders as opposed to encompassing our foreign policy, seems also essential to succeeding in this new, much more complicated, emerging world. On the one hand, of great power rivalry, of multipolarity, and on the other hand, of tremendous interdependence and vulnerability. I'll stop there. I know I covered a lot of territory today. I wanted to get through finally with these lectures, and I think that wraps it up as far as I'm concerned. What kinds of questions, thoughts, comments do you have? Who wants to start us out? You will have to unmute yourself to come into the conversation because everybody's muted right now. Bob, are you getting ready? Go ahead.
Yeah. The thought that occurred to me as you were talking is you're speaking to a bunch of old farts here who may be beyond the ability to affect any of these things. And I'm just hoping that you're making similar points to your students who are the upcoming generation, who are the ones that are really going to have to face so much of this.
I see Wilma has her hand raised. I think that's to slap you for calling her an old fart. But having said that, let me point out something to you. So I've been reading a fair bit of Bill McKibben recently, who you may know as one of the really most important scholars, thinkers, activists on climate change. And you may know that he started an organization about a year ago, not him alone, but he's one of the leaders, called Third Act. And the idea is for people over 60 to remain active in politics. And they're focused on climate change, and they're doing a lot trying to get banks to stop financing petrochemical companies' oil exploration, right? And so there's some really good stuff that old farts are doing these days. And so don't underestimate your capacity to still influence politics. But having
Well,
said
I'm
that,
involved in that, yes.
I am also trying to make similar points. All right, Bob, if you can, I'm getting a back from you. And then Wilma, go ahead.
Okay. There's an echo.
I'm trying to take care of it. Is it better now?
Yes.
Good, okay.
Okay, one was a very, very cynical reaction. Back in the day, China used famine as a way to control population increase. And that could possibly happen again on a global scale with climate migration happening. People just saying, let them go. And I hate to think about it, but that could happen if we can't handle what's coming up. The other thing is how fragile everything is now, because everything you say that needs to be done can only be done if Biden's the president or a Democrat's the president. Nothing will happen if the Republican Party gets in power. And it's too scary to think about.
Yeah, and so one of the questions I think, and I'm starting with your second comment first, is how much can a Democratic administration do to bind future presidents to continue along a course that those presidents might want to resist? And we saw with Donald Trump literally over 100 executive actions to undo the regulatory framework that have been set up to manage the environment. And it's worthwhile noting, right, that Biden and the Democrats in Congress have done a fair bit to try to legislatively mandate what had up until that point been administrative agency rules, so that the next president can't undo those rules, right? And so I'll just give the example very quickly, right? Barack Obama passed what we now call Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, right? And for more than a decade, the Republicans railed against that legislation and said that they would repeal and replace as soon as they got the power to do so. And lo and behold, 2017, 2018, they had the power to do so. Did they? Right? And they didn't. And they didn't because they didn't have anything to replace it with. And over the intervening years, the legislation had become sufficiently popular that replacing it didn't make any sense. What the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act do is to make a whole bunch of the very most powerful corporations in the United States have vested interest in transforming our infrastructure to make it sustainable, right? And if 2, 3, 4 years from now, Ron DeSantis tries to undo all that, some of the most powerful companies in this country are going to have big teams of lobbyists and lawyers to try to prevent that from occurring, right? And so, look, I'm not disagreeing with you. We need leadership on the right side for the rest of this century to really adequately address this problem. But I also think that there's not a snowflake's chance in hell that the Democrats are going to control the presidency for the next 75 years, right? And so, as opposed to hoping for the impossible, we need to plan for the probable and try to put in place policies that generate their own vested interests that become very difficult to repeal. So I think that's a little bit hopeful that there's another possibility. Sound right, Wilma?
Yes.
What was your first point? I concentrated
The
in
famine.
China and famine. That's right. I'm sorry.
Overpopulation, yeah.
Yeah, and here I you know, understand what you're referring to, and look, don't get me wrong. I think if we stay on the course that we're on right now, I hesitate to say it out loud. Hundreds of millions of people will die. It's hard to envision a scenario that doesn't involve mass casualties, right? Having said that, I also don't think there's much likelihood that in that scenario, the governments of the countries that are better prepared to withstand accelerating climate change, extreme weather, etc., are going to be able to keep the waves of migrants out. You know, how do we build the walls, the fences? Do we become a complete fortress society? Absent that, refugees are going to find ways of getting to us, right? And frankly, the degree of inhumanity required to turn people away who are obviously doomed if we don't admit them. Again, I don't want to.
David, the world managed to do that and turn away all the Jews in World War II.
Yeah, I was thinking about that even as I was talking. So yeah, let us hope that in the 21st century, we're just a little bit more cosmopolitan, we're a little bit more interconnected, we're a little bit more wired so that we have a hard time blinding ourselves to the suffering. And I don't know, but yes, you know, I don't think we're going to be able to seal our borders, even if we do turn some people away. Barbara, sorry, this is rather a grim topic. Barbara, you're still muted.
Okay, there.
There you
Okay,
go.
thank you.
There you go.
I wanted to build on you and Bob Yorger's conversation about third act. We have an ecology committee and climate action committee here at Piedmont Gardens, committees of residents. I'm speaking mostly to new residents who might not know about these committees. And the climate action committee is getting deeply involved with third act, and many of us have signed pledges to move our money from the big four banks that are funding most of the fossil fuel investment in the world. And so there are opportunities for us old farts to take action, even from our privileged perches in these lovely apartments we have.
So Barbara, I'm inclined that the issue here is less that I'm talking to people in their third act and more that I'm preaching to the converted. But you know, it's
yeah, we've got a nice
try to advance our
choir going.
Yeah.
We have a musical choir here of convertees, but it's always good to get the pep talks.
Yeah.
As
And
well
Joe-
as the doomsday.
Good, thank you. And I'm going to mute you. You've already muted yourself. Thank you. John, I thought I saw your hand up. Did the point go away? Did John go away?
He had to go off.
He
Sorry.
had to go off. Okay. All right, Ruth. Well, tell him I'm sorry we missed him. And I'm not seeing anybody else with a comment for today. So we'll move on to something else next week. I gave some topics to Amy. She's probably shared them with you. Looking forward to continuing the conversation. You all take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. Take care.